I guess you should be seeing my screen now.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I chose to present this paper. So You Complete Me, Human AI Teams and Complementary Expertise, which was from Kai this year. Especially because I liked how they created their experimental setup to actually control this complementarity of the human and AI teams. And of course, also because the results were quite interesting, but also in the methodology part, I think these are things that we could potentially reuse in some experiments. So the idea of the paper is to study this complementarity of the human and AI teams, and especially how they impact the performance of final decisions. So in context of decision making aided by an AI. And especially what they are saying is that we probably know already from other research that when there is a high level of complementarity between a human and AI team, then typically the performance, so the accuracy of the decisions are rather high. And when we have a very low complementarity, so more or less when both the human and the AI have the similar expertise, typically in that case, we know that the performance, so the accuracy of the decisions will be rather low. But we don't really know what happens in between. So when there is some overlap in the expertise, but not full overlap or no overlap at all. And so in the paper, they wanted to do controlled studies to actually understand exactly what happens there, and especially how performance evolve based on this complementarity then. So they have a set of questions that they mentioned first. So especially, they want to know whether people can detect when an AI assistant is accurate and they can rely on it. But they also wonder whether it's actually best to have this perfect complementarity, or whether humans need some overlap in expertise to be able to better rely on the AI. And so especially then they conclude, or they propose two research questions. So the first one is to investigate how the degree of complementarity affects the team performance. But also, to understand how it affects it, they look into reliance behavior and trust of the AI. And then they, based on the first result they get for this research question, they look at more variables, and especially they they look into explanations and whether explanations also affect this team performance, reliance behavior, and trust. And so they're I will explain further later, but they vary the type of explanations they provide and the level of complementarity, and they see how it impacts this team performance. But so first, for the first research question, they have a set of different hypotheses they want to test. The first one being that the human AI team performance is higher when the complementarity is higher. Second one being that people will rely more on the AI system when the complementarity is higher. And that the subjective trust will also be higher in that case. And to test this, they created one task, which is around object identification. There are 6 objects in this task. So 3 known shapes, so rectangles, triangles, and circles. So they show images of these, and while the human has to decide which one of these it is. But then they also have other shapes. So these are what they call fake shape because they created them themselves. The first one is this thing called senectus. The second one is this ultrices. And I guess already if I would ask you to identify from new images which one is what, I'm not sure whether you would be able to. So that's how they can play on the expertise, like the humans might not be able to recognize these shapes. I don't know if you want to take a guess at the difference between the two.
Is it the number of clearly evident corners? I think the Senectus has 3.
Yeah, well, 4 and 5 actually, but yeah.
Oh, 4 and 5. Okay.
And then they have another shape, so this pharetra, which is, yeah, a different kind of difference. I don't know if you can find.
Damn. That pharetra really looks like a Senectus to me. The one, the third example.
Yeah, that's quite similar.
Is that one defined by both points and curves?
That's part of it. So the idea is that the contour of the shape and the, well, points or lines or whatever is inside is either a line or not. So for the ultrices, when you have, for instance, when you look at the second one, you have dots for the contour and dot within the shape. Whereas for the pharetra, these two patterns, so for the contour and shape, won't be aligned.
So Agathe, were these shapes invented?
Yeah, they created them for the experiment.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, I see.
Yeah, and so that's what I thought was interesting, because this way they can really control, well, they can assume humans won't know about this, and that's where they can play for the complementarity of the teams.
Nice, very interesting idea.
Yeah, so this was just an explanation of that. Yeah, so the idea, as I was saying, is that they can play then on the expertise. And then, so what the task exactly consists in is to first present one of the shape and ask the human to decide which one it is. And then they provide the recommendation from the AI. And they ask the same question again to know whether, well, the decision will change because the human would be relying on the AI suggestion or not. And then they actually give feedback. So yeah, show whether this final decision was correct or incorrect. There is also a system of bonuses. So when they make a correct decision, then they get a bonus because they do crowdsourcing tasks actually. And so exactly how they create the various conditions, different conditions, is by varying. So we know that the human will only be able to recognize the regular shapes, at least at first, but then they vary how many of the fake shapes the AI can recognize. And so when the AI can recognize all fake shapes, well, we have high complementarity. But when, while it can only recognize regular shapes and no fake shapes, then there is complete overlap between the expertise. And then, well, the two intermediate conditions are depending on how many fake shapes the AI can recognize, which are not all of them, but part of them. And what is maybe important for the conclusions later is that the expertise itself is symmetrical in a sense that both the AI and the human are able to recognize three shapes. So in a sense, they have the same level of expertise because in both cases, it's three shapes. But then which expertise exactly it is varies because it depends whether they are regular shapes or fake shapes.
Got one quick question. Did the authors control for the visual reasoning aptitude across different users? Because when we were talking about expertise, it's nice to invent this. So I really like that idea of coming up with new things, because then you sort of say everyone's starting off at the same level of expertise because you're learning about it right now. But then because of the nature of tasks you pick, you might still allow certain users to, start off at a different level than others with respect to their own visual reasoning aptitude, right?
Yeah, they didn't control for that. No.
Okay, yeah. But does that even matter? I was thinking that through. So from how you understand it right now, or how you're explaining it right now, do we need to care about how what the distribution is with respect to performance of different users, or is that irrelevant?
Well, I imagine that could be relevant because yeah, maybe some users would be able to pick up more easily the fake shapes than others. So in that case, well, while they are actually making decisions, they will probably learn faster. So the expertise, well, varies across users as well. And yeah, they look a bit at how, while the users learn over time. So that plays a role there, yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, and so these were for the independent variables. For the dependent ones, they mostly look into the performance of the team. So of the first guess they have to make, and then the final guess based on the AI recommendation. Then they also measure the reliance on AI. For that, they have two metrics. One is the agreement frequency, so between the final decision and the AI recommendation. Then they also look at how many times the human will switch to agree with the AI compared to the first guess. And then to measure trust, they use this subjective trust measure, yeah, which is the scale of trust in automated systems. So what they do is that they recruit participants on Amazon Mechanical Turk, and the participants are assigned one of the 4 conditions of the 4 levels of AI team expertise. To control for the quality of the answers from the workers, they mostly check whether they answer correctly on the regular shapes that everybody should know. And so each worker will first have a training time where they will have to identify 6 shapes. 3 are the ones that these regular shapes that everybody knows, and 3 others that are again fake shapes, but different fake shapes than the ones I showed you before. So it's mostly to make sure that they understand the task they have to perform. And then they will have to answer 42 questions. So for each fake shape, they will see them 7 times. And have to make a decision, well, then 42 times. And at the end, that's where they will have to answer the questionnaire around trust. And they also asked a subjective rating of the AI's ability as well at the end. So about the results of this first experiment around performance. So first, they noticed that the participants are able to recognize the expertise of the AI based on this rating that they were giving of the AI's ability. And so, not surprisingly, I guess, for the regular shapes, they noticed that the participants anyway have high accuracy in their decisions, since they rely primarily on the knowledge they already had. For the fake shapes, well, for when it's a first guess, typically the human is equally bad for any condition, because anyway, well, they don't know these shapes at first. But then the final decision will increase depending on the level of complementarity, so which condition it is. So this is probably because, well, they learn to rely on the AI recommendations if they are correct. So the first hypothesis is well, correct, saying that the human AI team performance is higher when the AI has higher degrees of complementary expertise.
I got one question again. I may have missed this. So in their setup, how did they set the accuracy of the AI system? I guess that was manually controlled, right?
Yeah, so it was, I think, here. So yeah, they decided which shapes the AI system has to recognize correctly or not. And then to vary exactly the accuracy per shape, they were saying that they have when the AI is not accurate, it's because it will recognize only 2 out of the 7. So each shape is shown 7 times, and the AI will provide the correct recommendation only 2 times out of the 7 times they show the shape.
And that's consistent across all the shapes?
Well, it depends on the condition.
Okay.
So when there is this complete complementarity, well, in that case, the AI will be correct for all these fake shapes. But then when we have some kind of overlap, so not complete, then that's where they will only choose 2 out of 7 times for the AI to be correct. But I couldn't actually find in the paper exactly how they distribute it per shape, but I imagine that it's consistent across shape because of that.
Yeah. And so does this mean that each user sees all of the shapes? So each user sees 7 of them, you said? So
each user sees the 6 shapes 7 times, so 42 times in total.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. I see.
And yeah, they randomize the order in which they see the shapes and correct or incorrect
So then
recommendations.
it's consistently low AI performance, right? Because you're saying 2 correct out of 7 for each of the 6 shapes.
Yeah, so it looks like it's for each of the 6 shapes, but they don't explicitly say. So I imagine it's what it is. Yeah.
So if I'm interpreting the chart that you have up right here, in the case of, like, let's say level of complementary expertise 2, of one of the 3 regular shapes, we'll say square, the AI will, I think, always identify the square correctly, but not the other 2 regular shapes. And then it will always identify 2 of the 3 fake shapes correctly and never the 3rd.
Yeah, exactly. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, so that's
just one question. If you go back to that previous slide,
okay.
Slide number 10. Yeah. So over here, when we say that, or if the finding suggests that participants were able to recognize the different types of AI's complementarity. So that's what I'm thinking a little deeper about, right? Because I think that's where the challenge lies often, and how users recognize the complementarity. I think that's the real challenge, right?
Yeah.
When you're relying, you often don't really know what the AI system is good at and what you're probably good at. So when you say participants were able to recognize the different types of AI's complementarity, does it mean this was independent of whether it was a regular shape or a fake shape?
So to say that, actually, they just ask at the very end of all the tasks, the participant to rate the AI's ability, I think on a 7-point Likert scale, 5 or 7, I forgot.
Okay.
And so they just conclude this first sentence looking at the ratings of the AI's ability, actually.
Okay, because I mean, if it's obvious that the participants would want to rely on themselves for the regular shape, right? Like that makes sense. But for it to be a rigorous experiment, they would also need to have at least a condition where the AI is also recognizing the regular shapes completely accurately.
Yeah, they have this one, and that's the case where there is complete overlap in expertise.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So they do have that. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Okay. Oh, that's really interesting. So irrespective of that, participants were able to identify the AI complementarity accurately. Interesting. Okay.
So yeah, then to reflect further on why they observed this good or bad performance, they look at the patterns of reliance. Well, as I was saying anyway, for the regular shapes, they primarily rely on their own knowledge since they already know about these shapes. But for the fake shapes, what they see is that, well, when the expertise is complementary, the participant will actually rely on the AI's recommendations. And they can, so they did this analysis over time since the participants see each shape 7 times. And so they noticed that for the, well, first times they see the shapes, the agreement with the AI is the same across expertise, complementary expertise level. But then when you look at later times they see the shapes, the agreement will vary. So for the conditions where the complementarity is high, they will tend to agree more with the AI. But then when the complementarity is low, they will start to not agree as often with the AI. That's also what was showing on this graph up there. Yeah, which is another indication that they probably learn when the AI is reliable or not. They do a similar analysis with the switch to agree frequency, so the second metric. And yeah, they were, well, having the same kind of conclusion. So when they learn that the AI is reliable, so when there is this complementarity, high degree of complementarity, they will start to switch their answers more often towards what the AI recommends. And so that was verifying their second hypothesis, which was that people rely more on the AI system when the degree of complementarity is higher. Then they looked into trust to understand how it's impacting the trust. And probably again, not that surprisingly, when the complementarity is very low or very high, trust is following what we could imagine. So they trust less the AI when the complementarity is low, because they understand that, the AI will be wrong on the fake shapes. But when there is a very high complementarity, then they will trust the AI more. What was maybe more interesting, or that they discussed more at least, was that for the intermediate levels, so level 1 and 2, the trust is not increasing monotonically. So it shows that when there is intermediate complementarity, people might not exactly know when to rely on the AI actually. So their third hypothesis is only partially supported, because it's true that there is higher trust, subjective trust, with the higher degree of complementary expertise, so at level 3, but not exactly for level 1 and 2. And so that's where they were discussing that we probably want to work on how to communicate or identify the AI expertise when there is intermediate complementarity. And so that's how they justify their next research question, which is about presenting some kind of explanations of the AI's decision and see whether it helps the participants actually learn about this AI expertise. What they were showing as explanations is, one of these 4 each time. So the AI would explain that it recommends one of the classes because it sees certain patterns in the shape. And what they vary exactly is how this sentence of the AI recommendation is presented. So either they use the first person or the third person. So I know that would be the AI directly speaking. Whereas otherwise they name the AI shapebot and they say the shapebot knows, which provides some kind of distanciation with the AI recommendation. And they also look into a second type of distanciation by varying the actual verb that is used. So either I know that or I think that, think being more distancing than knowing. And so they have these 2x2 types of explanations provided by the AI in this case. And so then they ask the same question. So how does this 2x2 or types of language that they call overall embracing or distancing will affect the team performance, as well as the reliance behavior and the trust across these different levels of complementary expertise. then they have a set of hypotheses, but I can go over them directly when presenting the results. And so to study this second question, they have exactly the same tasks as before, but additionally, to the AI recommendation, they will provide this AI explanation, where so they will vary the point of view, so first or third person, and the belief of or distancing marker, so the verb that is used. So for instance, here they they were giving this example. So the AI would recommend the shape altruistic, and then it says because the shape bot, so the third person, believes, which would be the embracing marker, as 4 sides and the border and interior do not have the same patterns. And so again, to summarize the variables they look into, so for the independent ones, next to the complementarity level, so they look at the embracing or distancing languages. And for dependent variables, well, they measure the same 3 kind of aspects that we had in the previous experiment. But this time they especially look into, well, how the performance evolves when for the shapes where the AI is always correct and for the shapes where the AI is not always correct. So about the results. So when the shape, for the shapes where the AI is an expert, so when it's always providing the correct recommendation, they notice that while participants are making first guesses with an explanation more accurately than without an explanation. And their first guesses are so more accurate when the recommendation uses the first person and the third person. And when it's using the embracing belief marker than the distancing belief markers. Instead, for the shapes where the AI is not always correct. Well, again, the guesses are more accurate when there is an explanation. But this time it was more accurate when the belief marker would actually show distancing more than embracing. So for instance, the think and not the belief. But in this case, there was some kind of there was interaction between using first person and third person, the embracing or distancing verbs. So they conclude that their first hypothesis is verified. So the fact that providing an explanation that includes these features of the shapes that the AI recognizes helps the participants learn new expertise. So the idea is that simply because we provide this explanation, the participant will learn what are the important features of the shape that are useful to recognize the different classes. And so in the next turns, they can actually rely on these features to make a first guess. And they didn't only look at the first guess performance, but also the final decision performance, and were arriving at the similar conclusions. Then they looked more into, well, the reliance behavior to understand again what is happening there. And so for the shapes where the AI is 100% correct, they were noticing the same patterns as what I explained just previously, so that the embracing markers led to a higher agreement frequency in this case than the distancing factors. And so for the shapes where the AI is not always correct, they noticed that the participant would agree more, again, for embracing factor, so the first person, than the distancing factors, the third person. And this was not only the case for the first or third person, but also for the verb that is used, which led them to, either two other hypotheses verified, so that the embracing language will communicate the AI confidence in its recommendations, which leads to higher reliance. And instead that the distancing language communicates the AI low confidence in the recommendation, which leads to lower reliance than with the embracing language. And then there are similar conclusions as well for the switch to agree matrix. But then they also looked into the measures of trust. And in that case, well, the hypothesis they had was rejected. So the hypothesis was that embracing language will increase the human trust in the AI system, which was not necessarily the case. And especially they noticed that depending on whether it's embracing or distancing language, the trust was not actually affected differently. So to summarize the different findings, so they found that when you use explanations that use embracing language, so first person and the embracing verbs, the reliance on the AI is higher than when you use distancing language. And so higher reliance led especially to more accurately identify the shapes when the expertise is high with the AI. But when the AI expertise is low, then it would lead to actually lower performance of the team, because the humans would actually tend to agree with the AI because the AI is, let's say, convincing. It communicates some confidence with this embracing language, but actually, the AI is actually not being correct. So that leads, well, the human to trust this AI, but actually to make a wrong decision. But overall, the explanations, and in any case, help to learn about shapes, because as I was saying, the first guess performance increases over time, since at least the humans learn to look at the relevant features to identify the shapes.